Hello students, welcome to the lecture on the research process, and after the lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Describe the meaning of research, explain the research process, define research problem, discuss formulating hypothesis, explain the language of research, understand research proposal writing. Let's start with a brief introduction to the research process. The research process is a scientific process of inquiry and/or experimentation that involves purposeful, systematic, and rigorous collection of data. Analysis and interpretation of the data are then made in order to gain new knowledge or add to existing knowledge. Research has the ultimate of developing an organized body of scientific knowledge. Research is a systematic, controlled, empirical, and critical investigation of hypothetical propositions about the presumed relations about natural phenomena. Let's now discuss the meaning of research. Research is an academic activity, and as such the term should be used in a technical sense. According to Clifford Woody, research comprises defining and redefining problems, formulating hypotheses or suggested solutions, collecting, organizing, and evaluating data, making deductions and reaching conclusions, and at last carefully testing the conclusions to determine whether they fit the formulating hypothesis. The types of research. There are various types of research: descriptive versus analytical. Descriptive research includes surveys and fact-finding inquiries of different kinds. The major purpose of descriptive research is description of the state of affairs as it exists at present. In analytical research, on the other hand, the researcher has to use facts or information already available and analyze these to make a critical evaluation of the material. Applied versus fundamental. Research can either be applied or actions research or fundamental to basic or pure research. Applied research aims at finding a solution for an immediate problem facing a society or an industrial business organization, whereas fundamental research is mainly concerned with generalizations and with the formulation of a theory. Quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative research is based on the measurement of quantity or the amount. It is applicable to phenomena that can be expressed in terms of quantity. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is concerned with qualitative phenomena, that is, phenomena relating to or involving quality or kind. Conceptual versus empirical. Conceptual research is that related to some abstract ideas or theory. It is generally used by philosophers and thinkers to develop new concepts or to reinterpret existing ones. On the other hand, empirical research relies on experience or observation alone, often without due regard for system and theory. Some other types of research. All other types of research are variations of one or more of the above stated approaches based on either the purpose of the research or the time required to accomplish the research, on the environment in which the research is done, or it is on the basis of some other similar factor. Research process. Scientific research involves a systematic process that focuses on being objective and gathering a multitude of information for analysis so that the researcher can come to a conclusion. 8 steps of the research process as they apply to conducting a study. Step 1 is to identify the problem. The first step in the process is to identify a problem or develop a research question. The research problem may be something the agency identifies as a problem, some knowledge or information that is needed by the agency, or the desire to identify a recreation trend nationally. Step 2 is to review the literature. Now that the problem has been identified, the researcher must learn more about the topic under investigation. To do this, the researcher must review the literature related to the research problem. This step provides foundational knowledge about the problem area. Step 3 is to clarify the problem. Many times, the initial problem identified in the first step of the process is too large or broad in scope. In step 3 of the process, the researcher clarifies the problem and narrows the scope of the study. This can only be done after the literature has been reviewed. Step 4 is to clearly define the terms and concepts. Terms and concepts are words or phrases used in the purpose statement of the study or the description of the study. These items need to be specifically defined as they apply to the study. Step 5 is to define the population. In research terms, the group to involve in the study is always called the population. Defining the population assists the researcher in several ways. First, it narrows the scope of the study from a very large population to one that is manageable. Second, the population identifies the group that the researcher's efforts will be focused on within the study. Step 6. Develop the instrumentation plan. The plan for the study is referred to as the instrumentation plan. The instrumentation plan serves as the roadmap for the entire study, specifying who will participate in the study, how, when and where data will be collected, and the content of the program. Step 7 is to collect data. Once the instrumentation plan is completed, the actual study begins with the collection of data. The collection of data is a critical step in providing the information that is needed to answer the research question. Step 8 is to analyze the data. The researcher finally has data to analyze so that the research question can be answered. In the instrumentation plan, the researcher specified how the data will be analyzed. The researcher now analyzes the data according to the plan.
Welcome. We're going to take a look at the research process steps. Specifically, we're going to be looking at what are the steps in the research process and how can these steps be used for creating research papers and research projects. So, what is the research process? Research is a process of steps that takes a researcher from having a question to a completed research project. The research project presents a synthesis of information and the conclusions that come from the data analysis. It's actually several steps in there to get that done. So, first step is that you need to evaluate your prompt and choose a topic. What your prompt is, I'm talking specifically about the directions that you've been given in terms of the assignment to do your research. What you want to choose is a manageable topic, not too broad, not too narrow, somewhere in the middle. The next thing you do is you actually start your research. You start to collect sources, things like articles, interviews, websites that are academic or professional websites. Those are the kinds of things that you're looking for. One thing that's very important is that if your source is not from an expert, you do not want to use it. You only want to use expert sources for all of your research. Okay, now you've collected some sources, so what do? Well, you sit down and read them. And as you're reading them, you need to take notes on those. You can take notes in a variety of different ways. Whichever way works for you is to do those on 3x5 cards or 3-column note taking, or whatever method that you prefer, you can do that. Afterwards, you take a look at all of the information that you've located and you compile what is relevant to your specific topic. You need to take all of those notes now and organize them into an outline or a graphic organizer. It depends upon the specific assignment that you do as to what kind of graphic organizer that you do. Some teachers are very flexible and will let you do any kind of graphic organizer, whereas other teachers, or for particular projects, you'll need to do a specific style of outline. Alright, now you've got all of your information, you've got it organized into a nice graphic organizer. Now what do you do for step 4? So now what you do is you take a look at all of that data that you've collected, all of that information, and you look at where does the research point you. It should point you in a particular direction so that you can write your introductory thesis statement. Now that thesis statement may change over time, that's okay, but your thesis statement needs to be written according to where the research pushes you. You do not write your thesis statement before you start researching. That's backwards. Okay, so now you've got this wealth of information, all of this data that you've collected, and you've got a strong thesis statement that you're working with. So now you need to go ahead and write that draft. Okay, so you start off with your first draft, your rough draft, working on an introduction, a body, and a conclusion paragraphs. You want to make sure that you have a strong thesis statement. All of your body paragraphs should include parenthetical in-text source citations. That's where you're showing where you borrowed your information. And your works cited page is going to be at the very end in MLA format. Now the next step, step 6 here, takes several times to go through, but you edit, correct, and revise, and you'll typically go through that multiple times. I recommend to my students that they go through it at least 3 times. Editing, correcting, and revising. It can take a little bit of time, but it's really worth the effort because that's where you're going to come up with this perfected piece. So here are some specifics on how you might edit. Okay, reading the paper out loud. That can be a fantastic way for you to hear grammatical errors in particular. Giving the paper to someone else to read and for them to edit it, that can be very helpful. Sometimes it's difficult to find our own mistakes, but it's easier to find other people's mistakes. Go through, and if you have any comments from your instructor, read through those. You want to make sure that you're editing, correcting, and revising along the way. And you're always looking to work on this final perfect draft. It may take a few times through before you get it, but that's what you're working towards, is this final perfect draft. After that, you may have some sort of publishing format. You may share it with other students. It may go onto a website. It may be submitted into a magazine. In whatever manner that's appropriate for that particular paper, you may choose to seek out publishing. And you should always celebrate a job well done. Researching is tough work, so you definitely want to celebrate your accomplishment. Best practices in terms of looking at a research process. When you're working on a research paper, make sure that you follow the steps. Don't skip around or skip any of the steps. That can make things really difficult for you. Make sure that you're thorough with each of those steps. Don't skimp through any of them. Make sure you do the whole step to completion, and ask for help when you need it. Don't feel like you're bothering people by not asking for help. It's best to ask. What you should know at this point and be able to do is to understand the research process, know how to apply the steps, and be able to follow the steps and complete a research paper or project on your own.
Let's now discuss about research problem. A research problem is a statement about an area of concern, a condition to be improved, a difficulty to be eliminated, or a troubling question that exists in scholarly literature, in theory, or in practice that points to the need for meaningful understanding and deliberate investigation. Selection. A detailed list of criteria for selection of the problem follows. Novelty and avoidance of unnecessary duplication, importance for the field represented, interest and intellectual curiosity, training and personal qualifications, availability of data and method, special equipment and working conditions, sponsorship and administrative cooperation, cost and returns, hazards and penalties, time factor. Now we shall talk about the goal of research. There are two basic purposes for research: to learn something or to gather evidence. The first, to learn something, is for own benefit. Classification of research. Research can be differentiated into 5 categories. Historical research. Historical research involves understanding, studying, and explaining the past events. Its purpose is to arrive at some conclusions concerning the past occurrences that may help to anticipate or explain the present or future events. Descriptive research. It often involves collecting information through data review, surveys, interviews, or observation. Correlational research. Correlational research attempts to determine how related two or more variables are. This degree of relation is expressed as a correlation coefficient. Causal comparative research. Causal comparative research attempts to identify a cause-effect relationship between two or more groups. Causal comparative studies involve comparison in contrast to correlation research, which looks at relationship. Experimental research. Experimental research is guided by hypotheses or several hypotheses that states an expected relationship between two or more variables. An experiment is conducted to support or disconfirm this experimental hypothesis. The necessity of defined problem. Defining a research problem is the fuel that drives the scientific process and is the foundation of any research method and experimental design, from true experiment to case study. It is one of the first statements made in any research paper, and as well as defining the research area should include a quick synopsis of how the hypothesis was arrived at. Operationalization is then used to give some indication of the exact definitions of the variables and the type of scientific measurements used. This will lead to the proposal of a viable hypothesis. Structuring the research problem. Defining a research problem is crucial in defining the quality of the answers and determines the exact research method that is used. A quantitative experimental design uses deductive reasoning to arrive at a testable hypothesis. Qualitative research designs use inductive reasoning to propose a research statement. Defining a research problem. Many scientific researchers look at an area where a researcher generated some interesting results but never followed up. It could be an interesting area of research which nobody else has fully explored. A scientist may even review a successful experiment, disagree with the results, the tests used, or the methodology, and decide to refine the research process, retesting the hypothesis. This is called the conceptual definition and is an overall view of the problem. The operational definitions. The operational definition is the determining the scalar properties of the variables. Behavioral biologists and social scientists might design an ordinal scale for measuring and rating behavior. These measurements are always subjective but allow statistics and replication of the whole research method. This is all an essential part of defining a research problem. Formulating hypothesis. A research hypothesis is a statement of expectation or prediction that will be tested by research. Before formulating a research hypothesis, read about the topic of interest. Gain sufficient information about the topic that will enable us to narrow or limit it and express it as a research question.
Hello class, welcome to a very brief tutorial on how to form a hypothesis. My name is Valencia Cody Barker and I'm one of the full-time remote assistant professors here at Ashford University. I will be assisted today by my friend Jenna. Jenna has a question about fish behavior and she would like some assistance with forming a hypothesis. Before we can assist Jenna, let's have a quick review of the scientific method. I am 100% sure that you've reviewed this information in your textbook, but as a refresher we'll go over it again just in case. Remember, the scientific method always begins with an observation of a situation or a problem. We form a hypothesis, and we'll be working on that more today, followed by an experimental procedure where we gather and analyze data, and then we draw some conclusions. So let's make sure that we fully understand what a hypothesis is before we help Jenna. A hypothesis is a supposition or a proposed solution or prediction to a particular scenario. So yes, it's correct to say that it's a prediction statement, but it's a very structured, formal type of prediction statement. And there are two key components of a hypothesis. You must have experimental variables, both dependent and independent, and your hypothesis must be measurable or testable in some way. So keep those two keys in mind as we help Jenna. So Jenna has observed for us that fish sometimes leap from the water, and she has also observed that there are items near these fish, such as a snake or soda cup or donut. So let's go back to our keys. First of all, those variables. Let's identify the experimental variables here. We have a dependent variable, which would be the fish, because that's the target organism or what we're interested in. And then anything that may potentially influence the fish behavior, then that would be the independent variable. In this case, we have several independent variables: Jenna, the donuts, the soda cup, and the snake. Next, let's see if we can write a measurable scenario or a testable hypothesis. Let's go, Jenna. Fish sometimes behave strangely in lakes. Well, the problem here is we have a dependent variable, but we don't have an independent variable, and it's nearly impossible to measure how strangely something is behaving. So this is not a good hypothesis. How's this one? Fish leap from the water if there are donuts nearby. Well, that's actually pretty good. Our dependent variable is present, donuts are one of our independent variables, and we could test this by flooding the lake with donuts and watching the fish behave, how the fish behave. Be a terrible waste of donuts, but we could do it. How's this one? If there's trash in the water, fish are more likely to jump up and down. Well, pretty good, except the word trash is rather general. You'd want to be more specific and perhaps say soda cups. If there are predators like snakes nearby, then fish will jump from the water. Much better. Very specific. We used an independent variable of a snake, and our dependent variable is present. We could test this by adding lots and lots of snakes to the water, and then watching fish behavior. Be kind of scary, though. So, finally, let's review. A hypothesis is indeed a prediction statement, but it must include your key components of the experimental variables, and it must be measurable or testable in some way.
following are some hints for the formulation of a hypothesis. Be sure to read on the topic to familiarize us with it before making a final decision. As noted, a research hypothesis is more than just a topic. It has two elements, variables that are in relation to each other. Avoid judgmental words in a hypothesis. Value judgments are subjective and are not appropriate for a hypothesis. Our hypothesis must involve an issue or a question that cannot be answered exclusively by the discipline of law. Be sure that each term in hypothesis is clearly understood and defined. Do not deal in generalities or assume that the reader knows the meaning of a technical term. Specify, if appropriate, whether we will be dealing with state or federal law or both on a comparative basis if appropriate. Know that our hypothesis may change over time as our research progresses. We will be expressing our hypothesis in three ways: as a one-sentence hypothesis, as a research question, and as a title for our paper. Let's now move on to talk about the language of research, construct. What is a construct? Is a question commonly asked by students who are new to research. In social sciences, psychological constructs are more complex ideas that we as humans form in order to summarize observations about things that we cannot see directly. Mentally, we can visualize concrete objects such as a computer, a book, or other items that we can see and touch. These things are directly observable and we can easily describe and measure them. But many of those things we deal with in everyday life are not so clearly conceived. It is much more of a challenge to visualize job satisfaction, citizenship, or motivation. These are sometimes referred to as higher level abstractions within our minds or psychological constructs. Let's now discuss about the concepts and the variables. A concept is an abstraction based on characteristics of perceived reality, and defining concepts in research. This is important in research and in real life for that matter. In using words, we cannot communicate unless we are using the same words for the same things. They could both be right if they are defining the concepts of alienation differently. Generally speaking, we should think about three things when dealing with definitions and concepts. Keep the definitions clear. This is not easy because we use words to define other words. Usually definitions try to use more simple words to define more complex words. This is a useful way to approach definitions of abstract concepts. There are a variety of political dictionaries that can be useful. Make the definition appropriate. By appropriate means you use a definition that is consistent with the way the concept is used in the literature. What too many researchers do is stipulate a new definition for a term that others have used. Avoid defining concepts with related concepts. We should create definitions with simpler words as mentioned above. So if we are talking about ideology, we should say something like attitudes about the degree to which government should be involved in regulating economic matters and regulating personal behavior. Avoid circular definitions. Political alienation may be the degree to which one is alienated to politics, but that is not a good definition. Substitute the feeling of separation from for alienation and we are closer to a legitimate definition. Use simpler words to describe all the things in this metal box, variables and measurement. The text gives a definition for a variable, a measured concept. That is not quite good enough because if we measure a concept, that is, if we turn it into something that can be observed and all the measurements come out the same, then it is a constant, not a variable. Reliability. It refers to the consistency of an operational measure. A reliable measure will yield the same results over and over again when applied to the same thing. An elastic yardstick is unreliable. Validity. It refers to whether the measure actually measures what it is supposed to measure. If a measure is unreliable, it is also invalid. Now let us talk about research proposal, writing. A research proposal is just that, it is what we propose to do. First, we need to think what we propose or intend to research. Once we have done this, the next step is to describe how we will conduct the research. Simply, research proposal should reflect what we are going to research, why we are going to research this particular area, and what is the significance of researching this area, and how are we going to conduct the research. The structure of a research proposal. While each discipline has some slightly different requirements for setting out a research proposal, the major differences will be dictated by the kind of research we are undertaking, whether we are doing what is called primary research or secondary research. Secondary research means that we are not gathering or creating our own empirical data, but we are using existing data that someone else has collected, recorded and analyzed. Research proposal outline. The proposal needs to show clearly that we understand our field, we have identified an area that warrants research, and we know how to conduct that research. It should contain some or all of the following elements: working title, statement of the problem or the gap in the current research in our field of study, context in which the problem arises, historical and current research in the field, reasons why the problem exists and justification for the addressing it, methodology you will use to address the problem, key research questions, expected contribution to knowledge, time frame and special resources, references or bibliography. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Research in common parlance refers to a search for knowledge. One can also define research as a scientific and systematic search for pertinent information on a specific topic. Research process deals with the ways and strategies used by researchers to understand the world around us. A hypothesis is a prediction of expected outcomes. It states the relationships between variables that the researcher expects to find as a result of the study. Historical research involves understanding, studying, and explaining the past events. Its purpose is to arrive at some conclusions concerning the past occurrences that may help to anticipate or explain present or future events. Defining a research problem is the fuel that drives the scientific process and is the foundation of any research method and experimental design, from true experiment to case study.